Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm so delighted to see all of you here. My name is Heidi Vostick. I'm Dean of the College of Liberal Arts. I want to acknowledge here in the room my predecessor as Dean, Ken Fold. He's loving life. He's sitting there in his jeans, and last year this was him. So thank you, Ken, for being here. It's great to see all of you. To read a David Shribman column is to read history. Whether he's writing about congressional dysfunction for a syndicated political column or about hiking the White Mountains, he brings to each context the past. While other commentators roar about the extraordinary election of 2016 and its unpredictability, its break from the norm, David Shribman takes us on a journey through the decades, through Buchanan and Cleveland, Franklin Pierce and Herbert Hoover, a political meditation proving that these times are not so strange after all. Who would have thought, as Shribman wrote recently, that the Trump-Clinton battle in some ways mirrors the 1960 contest that pitted a Washington insider, a senator, 8-year vice president, former member of the House, against a newcomer from Massachusetts? We leave each Shribman column understanding a little bit more about political parties, political personalities, and the art of governing. The executive editor of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette and a regular panelist on Washington Week in Review and Meet the Press, Shribman has shared his political insights for over 30 years. For the Boston Globe, he served as Washington bureau chief, as well as assistant managing editor and columnist. For the Wall Street Journal, he was a national political correspondent. And for the New York Times, his beat was Congress and national politics. A native of Salem, Massachusetts, he began his career at the Buffalo Evening News, where he worked his way from covering City Hall to Capitol Hill. He was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 1995 for his analytical reporting on Washington and the American political scene. David Shribman's ties to New Hampshire are strong. He's a summa cum laude graduate and an emeritus member of the Board of Trustees of Dartmouth College. Although his career, both professional and academic, he studied at Cambridge University as a James Reynolds scholar, have taken him away from the Granite State, he returns again and again, year after year, to scale the presidentials and swim the swift river. And as with his political columns, his vacation writings provide a rich backstory from the formation of mountains to the history of the Appalachian Mountain Club huts. David Shribman has earned 4 honorary degrees, served on the selection committee of the JFK Library's Profiles of Courage Award, and lectured and taught courses at universities across the country. We're just delighted that he's accepted our invitation to be the John H. Holden Lecturer this year. And let me say just a word about this lecture series. This lecture was made possible by the John T. Holden Memorial Fund in the College of Liberal Arts here at UNH. The fund is dedicated to bringing signal scholars in the social sciences to our campus. I'd like to thank Judith Vernelli, class of 1957, and her husband, Dr. Frank Vernelli, for their longtime support of the Holden Fund. On behalf of everyone in the College of Liberal Arts, we thank you, Judy and Frank, for your commitment to having scholars come to our campus to teach and inspire our students and challenge the way we think. Without further ado, would you please join me in welcoming tonight's very special guest, David Shribman.
Thank you, Heidi. Thank you. Thank you, Heidi. You know, there's a story about a preacher who built a new church, was thinking about building a new church, and they were pressed for money, and he suggested, well, why don't you just leave out the front row because no one ever sits there. So you make me feel a lot better, all of you back there, if you came up here, because I don't have a mic, and this way I won't have to shout so much. So if you want to just take a second and move up here, it'll make me a little more comfortable, and you'll actually be able to hear the stupid jokes I have. And thank you also, Heidi, for that introduction that my mother wrote. She's no longer with us, but she's a great writer, and she would approve of every syllable. And thank you also, of course, to Judy and Frank for your remarkable generosity, to Attorney General Rath and a bunch of my other friends and guests who came here to visit your splendid campus. And I should say before we start that I spent the day with your students, and they are remarkable, and they're engaged, and they're not on their phones. And so I'm grateful for the first 2 and astonished by the third. So I'm very, very glad to be here, and it's a lovely place. I'm particularly happy with the result of the Dartmouth UNH game 2 weeks ago. And it's, as you say, Heidi, I do more than anybody except a museum director and maybe somebody who runs an Alzheimer's clinic. I'm living in the past. So I do know it was 40 years since last we did the right thing against the Wildcats here. Anyhow, let me start, give you a sense of what we're going to do this evening. I've written, I have some prepared remarks, and will deliver those. And if I get bored reading my own speech, I'll just stop and ask for questions. And if I finish it without getting bored, and I sense that you aren't, we'll just open up for questions. But my prepared remarks are meant to begin a conversation, not to end them, and to be preface to your questions and not to choke them off. So we'll start this way, after my thanks to all of you. In 1835, going back some, during the presidency of Andrew Jackson, the American writer Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote a short story, the details of which all of you in New Hampshire should know. It involves a family living in the mountains, and the action starts when an avalanche begins. My kids know this story by heart. It rolls that avalanche onward, right toward the modest homestead they inhabited. And in their distress and panic, the family runs from the house, only to be overtaken by the rocks as their family home remained unscathed. Now, the story had its basis in an actual event that happened, it turns out, almost exactly 190 years ago, about 70 miles from here, in the lovely corner of your state called Crawford Notch. Now, you may know this story as the Willie Slide. Nathaniel Hawthorne called his story The Ambitious Guest. Well, that's a long introduction to what those of us who live in Pennsylvania and those of you who live in New Hampshire know, which is that our two states are playing host to two very ambitious guests, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. They're almost permanent presences here in New Hampshire and in my home state of Pennsylvania. In fact, some of you may know that you had trouble getting home last night because of all the security around Mrs. Clinton. And at this very moment, I'm surprised you're not all there, Donald Trump is speaking in Bedford. But not only here, the two ambitious guests, along with their campaign surrogates, are also in Florida and Ohio and North Carolina as well. The rest of the country is a campaign desert. You won't see either Trump or Clinton there unless their campaign planes develop engine trouble and they have to touch down for maintenance. But in all of our target states, yours and mine, the candidates are a constant presence, the result of how the peculiar United States Electoral College system works. It forces candidates to win individual states rather than a countrywide popular vote majority, and it warps the race for the White House. So let me tell you the entire campaign in 30 seconds. We'll call it the tale of two brothers. One of these brothers is named Frank Lucchino. He's a friend of my wife's and mine. He has senior status as a Pennsylvania judge, and he also has a home on the west coast of Florida. He's weary of the campaign advertisements at his home in Pennsylvania, and he dreads what happens next week when he returns to Florida. Now, the other brother is Larry Lucchino. You may know his name. He's the retired president and chief executive of the local baseball team, the Boston Red Sox. He'll hardly see any of the campaign. He lives in Massachusetts, where the popular Republican governor himself won't even vote for Trump. Overall, the Bay State, deep Democratic blue in the past 7 consecutive elections, is a power center for Hillary Clinton, who went to Wellesley College in the state and who has vacationed on Martha's Vineyard for years. So the U.S. presidential campaign has come down to a very few states that are being saturated with advertisements and candidate visits, while about 4/5 of our states are being virtually ignored. Indeed, just as the general election campaign formally opened this month, 4 campaign planes were sitting on the tarmac at Cleveland's Hopkins International Airport. They belong to Mrs. Clinton, Mr. Trump, Tim Kaine, the vice presidential candidate for the Democrats, and Mike Pence, the governor of Indiana and the vice presidential candidate from Indiana. All 4 planes on one tarmac. I arrived here, I saw Hillary Clinton's plane. Right now, the fabulous Trump plane is sitting there now. Together, New York and California account for 84 electoral votes, which is a little less than 1/3 of what you need to win the White House. California, which is the home state of 2 relatively recent presidents, Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, has voted Democratic the past 7 elections in a row. New York, which has elected Mrs. Clinton twice to the Senate, also elected to the presidency, Franklin Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, among others. New York has voted Democratic the past 8 elections in a row. So these 2 megastates, which account for 57 million people, almost twice the population of Canada, are so safely Democratic that they're not in play at all. The candidates may repair there to sleep, Mrs. Clinton to Chappaqua, New York, and Mr. Trump to his modest hovel in Manhattan, or perhaps to raise money in Orange County, California for Mr. Trump, Manhattan and Silicon Valley for both of them. But there'll be no rallies in Buffalo, none in Syracuse, none in Rochester, to say nothing of Albany, Schenectady, and Troy. Nothing in Anaheim, nothing in San Diego, Fresno, or Sacramento. In the sprint to Election Day, the candidates have no time for states, even giant ones, that are not competitive. And that's a lot of these states. Fully 2/3 of the states have voted for the same party 5 consecutive times. They're pretty much off the campaign itinerary. In fact, most of the country is off the itinerary, for virtually the entire presidential campaign is being conducted in fewer than a dozen states that are considered competitive, and lucky for you, this is one of them. 40 states are larger than our own New Hampshire, but it's considered a swing state and a particularly sore spot for Democrats. You all know that had the independent candidate Ralph Nader not siphoned off votes that almost certainly would have gone to Albert Gore in 2000, the vice president would have prevailed in the election, and the contretemps in Florida would have been irrelevant, and none of us would have ever heard the phrase hanging Chad. Then, of course, there's Ohio, in part because it's so closely divided, and in part because of a curious political phenomenon that involves the Buckeye State. Here it is. No Republican candidate ever has ascended to the White House without winning Ohio. Now, that even includes Abraham Lincoln, who was the second GOP candidate and the first winner. He won it by 44,288 votes in 1860. Mr. Trump is virtually living there these days. The candidates have singled out North Carolina for special favor. Senator Barack Obama carried the state in 2008, but lost it 4 years ago. That state has voted Democratic only one other time since 1968, and that was when the Southerner Jimmy Carter ran the first time. Now, he lost that state the second time to Ronald Reagan, and Mr. Trump considers it within his reach, even if Mrs. Clinton has a slender lead there. Now, the respected Politico website gives Mrs. Clinton a 6 percentage point lead in what it considers the 11 battleground states. But some of those states seem to be slipping beyond Mr. Trump's grasp, even as others are slipping into his grasp. Michigan, which has been Democratic in the past 6 consecutive elections, might ordinarily be a target for a Manhattan businessman who hates NAFTA. But 2/3 of female voters in the state and more than a quarter of strong Republican voters consider Mr. Trump unqualified. So that gives Mr. Trump little room to fashion a majority in a state that has 4 times as many electoral votes as New Hampshire. Now, one caveat here. The election map is not immutable, and thus campaign itineraries are changeable. The country's second largest state, Texas, has been safely Republican for 10 of the last 11 elections, but it may become competitive before Election Day. The Lone Star State now is in a virtual tie. Mrs. Clinton and her husband have made several visits to Texas, and in fact, Mr. Clinton, when he was after he graduated from Georgetown, went to Texas in 1972, and he ran Texas for George McGovern. He didn't do that well, but he ran Texas for George McGovern, and he knows the state well. The Clintons may be back, and if they do go back, so will Mr. Trump. But don't look for either of them in most of the Farm Belt. Like Dorothy, they're not in Kansas anymore. That's because Kansas has voted Republican in 18 of the last 19 elections. Now let's take a few seconds and examine what this presidential race is really about. Presidential races usually settle into discernible narratives at about this time. But unlike everything else about this election, the tone and timbre of it, the frantic name-calling, this campaign is markedly different. It has an unusual amount of moving parts, factors still in play as October approaches. In the next few minutes, I'm going to give you a field guide to the most important ones. Number 1, mobilizing the base. Ordinarily, this is the easy part. For the political base is what gives a campaign its stability, in which it provides a safety net when things go awry, as they almost always do. But not this campaign, for this is a campaign of stolen bases. Mr. Trump is threatening to poach the blue-collar vote that's been the Democrats' bedrock since the New Deal, which began more than 3/4 of a century ago. Mrs. Clinton is threatening to do the same with the moderate Republican vote, the GOP mainstay that's helped to elect the party's past two presidents, George H.W. and George W. Bush. So the result is that Mr. Trump can claim the support of only 72% of likely Republican voters. And that figure is producing deep anxiety among party strategists. But Mrs. Clinton is faring only slightly better because she can claim only 82% of Democrats, which is not a particularly strong number either. And that's of concern to their party leaders. If Mr. Trump can't rally Republicans, his campaign will be seriously endangered. Now, this summer, he traveled deep into NAFTA territory, and he visited Mexico before returning to Arizona, where he reinforced his immigration plan. His goal was to calm his base, but early indications suggest he may have further alienated it. Now, the next card is the racist card. Bigotry, an accusation once tacitly banned from presidential campaigns, has emerged as one of the great points of debate here. Mr. Trump called his rival a bigot, and Mrs. Clinton has not veiled her return volley, charging that the Manhattan businessman has been, quote, reinforcing harmful stereotypes and offering a dog whistle to his most hateful supporters. For years, Republican strategists have wanted to make inroads among black voters, who at one time were reliable supporters of the party of Lincoln. Moderate Republicans provided the margin of victory for both the 1964 Civil Rights Bill and the 1965 Voting Rights Bill. Neither would have passed only with Democratic votes. But since 1968, when Richard Nixon began his Southern strategy, aimed at the whites in the 11 states of the old Confederacy, blacks have redoubled their devotion to the Democrats, an alliance that really dates only as recently as the New Deal. Now, perhaps in the biggest political gamble, Mr. Trump is undertaking an offensive to win black support, only to find that some of the rhetoric he's using is itself offensive to some of its target audience. In asking black voters, what the hell do you have to lose, he set off a firestorm, and Mrs. Clinton answered the question, what the hell do you have to lose? She says, you have to lose everything. She's running an ad saying just that in Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and of course, North Carolina. Now, Mr. Trump was merely saying out loud what Republican strategists have been saying for decades, that blacks have been taken for granted and that Democrats count on their votes but provide little in return to them. This was an argument particularly favored by Republicans close to Jack Kemp, the late representative from Buffalo, New York, who ran for president here in New Hampshire in 1988 and later served in George Bush's cabinet. So far, however, there's less evidence that Mr. Trump has made any inroads among blacks than that he has failed in his efforts. Number 3, floating other people's boats. Ordinarily, a strong presidential vote has what Americans call a coattail effect. Members of Congress ride to Capitol Hill on the strength of the person who takes the White House. Now, a classic example is Ronald Reagan's victory in 1980, which gave the Republicans a pickup of 12 seats in the Senate and 35 in the House. And I think, Attorney General Rath, you'll confirm this, I think Warren Rudman was one of those, right? It turfed an entire generation of liberal Democrats, including Birch Bayh of Indiana, John Culver of Iowa, a great Harvard running back, Frank Church of Idaho, Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin, a famous environmentalist, and George McGovern of South Dakota, who had been the Democrats' presidential nominee just 2 elections earlier. Democrats dearly hope that Mrs. Clinton will sweep them to power in the Senate and at least reduce the Republican margin in the House of Representatives, if not overturn it totally. But the Republicans no doubt recall 1956, when Dwight Eisenhower won re-election, although his Republicans did not retain control of Congress. After all, there are no coattails on an Eisenhower jacket, the garment with the pleated back and buckle sides that the 34th president favored. Now, 60 years later, the Dickies version of the Eisenhower jacket, it remains a fashion icon. You can get one for $54 at Kohl's department store. It's available in black, navy, and charcoal, though Ike's was the classic military olive drab. So each candidate can have a different color. Mr. Trump has already ordered his Eisenhower jacket, and Mrs. Clinton may find herself in the fitting room by November. In this campaign, we've witnessed many, many remarkable things. We've seen many mighty Republican oaks falling in the political forest, one of them named Bush. New extremes in campaign rhetoric, old traditions in campaign comportment being benched, and Americans expending more emotion arguing over this election than perhaps any time in recent history. But however it turns out, November's election will be a historical turning point, perhaps ending the male domination in the White House that's prevailed for more than 2¼ centuries, or perhaps sweeping into office a businessman president with no political experience but unmatched political celebrity and wealth. And as we approach the meat of this campaign, the big October stretch just a few days away, 4 important gaps need to be recognized and assessed. These are essential to understanding the American passage this year, and how they play out will be essential in determining who occupies the White House next January. Here's what they are. 1, I call this the satisfaction gap. It's not as yawning as commentators believe. 60% of Democrats are satisfied that Mrs. Clinton is their nominee. 45% of Republicans feel that way about Mr. Trump. Ordinarily, such a gap may mean a disaster for the candidate lagging in party satisfaction, and it's possible that the condition will prevail, imperiling Mr. Trump. But this year is different from any other, in part because of the gap that follows. Number 2, the partisanship gap. This political season has seen the most dramatic transformation of partisanship assumptions since 1980, when Ronald Reagan drew legions of Democrats to his GOP candidacy, and perhaps even since 1936, when President Franklin Roosevelt's landslide victory over Republican Governor Alf Landon of Kansas sealed a vital shift in the American political profile. Some of the students I met today think I covered the 1936 election. I told them, no, I started with Dewey and Truman in '48. The reason for this, Mr. Trump's appeal to blue-collar voters who have sided with him in astonishing numbers fractures the Democrats' long-standing alliance with these people, as we've said before. Mr. Trump's fortunes depend in large measure on his ability to mobilize these voters and to perhaps expand their numbers, without alienating the traditional Republicans, 45% of whom preferred another candidate and who still, many of them, are cool to Mr. Trump. Here's number 3, the geographical gap. There are great changes in the geography of American politics. Seldom are they as stark as they are today. West Virginia is my favorite example. Back in 1988, Democratic nominee Michael Dukakis easily carried West Virginia with 52% of the vote. Remember that number. Democrat, 52%, 1988. A quarter century later, in 2012, another Massachusetts governor, this time a Republican, Mitt Romney, carried West Virginia with 62% of the vote. So what do we have there? That is a change of massive proportion, a higher percentage in West Virginia than he received in blood red Alabama or Mississippi, in a state that Michael Dukakis carried fairly easily. Now, at play there were several factors, of course. The changing fortunes of coal, strong feelings about guns, both of which are to the Republicans' strong advantage, especially in the wake of Barack Obama's advocacy of gun control measures and Mrs. Clinton's comments suggesting that coal mining was doomed. But these kind of transitions are underway elsewhere, sometimes to the Democrats' advantage. In Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, right outside Philadelphia, Vice President George H.W. Bush easily defeated Michael Dukakis, 60% of the vote in 1988. Remember that, 60%, 88. Romney, who was the GOP nominee in 2012, didn't come close. Obama won the same place by 57%. That's a big change in 24 years. A leading indicator of the shifting geography of American politics is this. This summer, Mrs. Clinton campaigned in Nebraska, which has voted Republican in 18 of the last 19 elections. The only exception since 1936 being the Goldwater debacle. By the way, the only county in all of New England that voted for Goldwater was Carroll County, not far from here. So forbidding to Democrats is Nebraska that in his first 410 weeks as president, Bill Clinton had visited every state but Nebraska. He touched down in Nebraska 42 days before leaving office. Authenticity gap, the last one. He has it, she doesn't. No one doubts that Mr. Trump is authentic. He's authentic in every way. He's a remarkable character on the stump, too much so, some Republicans worry, while Mrs. Clinton seldom shows the raucous sense of humor and deep humanity that her longtime associates insist she possesses, and that others find difficult to believe. He seems loose, she seems tense. He shuns the briefing books, we saw that in dramatic fashion. She devours them. He has no filters, she measures every word. Overall, this is a Trump advantage until it isn't a Trump advantage, and it wasn't. Now, a few final words on what this confusing campaign is all about. It is at its base a struggle for the hearts of voters who are at once desperate for change and who at the same time are satisfied with their well-being. It's an electorate that's impatient with our leadership, but highly supportive of our president. The numbers bear out these statements, they're contrary statements. One poll shows that a solid majority of Americans want to take the country in a different direction. But another poll shows that people believe their lives have improved since Obama took office. Mr. Obama, meanwhile, has high approval ratings. So in short, to understand this sentence, this election in about 12 words, here they are. Things are pretty good, and we need to change them. The two presidential nominees are listening to this bit of wisdom, at least a little, and at least to some of it. Across this important swing state here in New Hampshire and across the country, they've seized on the change element of the voters' message, with Mr. Trump vowing to make America great again, even as he says it's already great, and Mrs. Clinton stretching to assure the public that she's no Bill Clinton, who supported NAFTA, a tough crime bill, and welfare reform, the things that got her husband reelected. And that she isn't really that much of a Mr. Obama either, the free trader and faint defender of America. Even so, how to portray Mr. Obama and his record is a vital question for campaign strategists of both parties. Every presidential election is a decision point for Americans, a moment to declare whether the path the country's taking is worthwhile or whether to swerve from it. Great changes in America's direction came in 1920, when Woodrow Wilson's engagement-oriented Democrats were repudiated by Senator Warren G. Harding, that giant, and his Republicans, who turned away from Europe and looked inward, and again a dozen years later, when Governor Franklin Roosevelt defeated Herbert Hoover and promoted a more interventionist role for Washington in the economy. Other major changes came in 1952 with the election of Dwight D. Eisenhower, and 8 years later with the ascension of John Kennedy. And again in 1980, as we've said before, when the country turned from Jimmy Carter to give Ronald Reagan and his supply-side vision a try. The debate about the state of the nation is the centerpiece of this campaign, but the debate seems to be miscast slightly. That Gallup survey I mentioned a minute ago plainly shows that Americans believe their standard of living has actually increased since President Obama entered the White House. When the president was inaugurated, 73% of Americans said they were satisfied with their standard of living. Today, 80% say the same thing. More dramatic is the Americans' assessment of their expectations. When Mr. Obama took office in 2009, 42% said their standard of living was getting better. Today, that figure hugs the 60% figure. Moreover, more than 55% of Americans say they are thriving, the highest figure Gallup has found in all the years it sought this information. Even so, the candidates clearly sense a stream of discontent in the electorate, because they do polling too. But the discontentment may be of an unusual character altogether this time. Now, writing in the conservative journal National Review, David French argued this very month that the country in 1980 was primed for resurgence. A good president had only to create the right conditions for success. This time, he continued, our culture is weak, our politics are weak. Our nation is far less sound, beset with cultural problems that lie far beyond the capacity of any politician to fix. And so it's ironic that at a time when problems seem beyond the range of traditional politicians, two untraditional politicians are competing for the White House. The Trump campaign may argue that Mrs. Clinton has the outlook and persona of a traditional politician. But as the first female nominee of a major American party, she's by definition untraditional. And as Secretary of State, she emphasized global issues involving the role and welfare of women to an extent that no chief American diplomat had ever contemplated. And Mr. Trump, of course, is the least traditional nominee of modern times. All of this is occurring as the profiles of the two parties are undergoing important, perhaps lasting change, just as the country seeks change and experiences a general sense of contentment. Has there ever been such a confusing time? Perhaps we could look to the 1920s, a decade that didn't roar for everyone, unless you conclude that some of the roar was discontent, especially among working people. Now, next month, the Sports Illustrated writer S.L. Price releases a book called Playing Through the Whistle. Excerpts of it were in Sports Illustrated last week. It's an important study of the steel town of Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, which is right near where my wife and I live. Aliquippa has produced, among others, Pete and Press Maravich of basketball fame, Tony Dorsett and Mike Ditka of the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and Ty Law, whom you all know is the gangling defensive back who was on 3 New England Patriots Super Bowl championship squads, even though the Patriots are doomed to lose to the Steelers in a few weeks. In the course of telling this remarkable story of Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, Mr. Price argues that the distilled image of the 1920s, full of amoral flappers swanning about a sea of bathtub Jim, is but a dim caricature of a nation unnerved. A dim caricature of a nation unnerved. The same, I think, could be said of our own confusing time. Thank you very much. I'm going to thank you for that generous applause. I'm going to see how much time we have left. How much time? We have about 20 minutes.
Time,
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So let's take questions, and you answer the questions, and I'll evade them. Anybody have any?
Could I get us started, David? Is it
Oh,
okay?
sure.
So, thinking about the state of politics today, what is it that you would most hope university students can learn from their studies about how to participate in a more effective democracy?
Well, that's a good question. I'll repeat the question. What should UNH and other students learn about their country and their responsibilities in an age like this, in a campaign like this? First of all, they need to remember what happened in this very state in 2000, and we went over that today. That voting for a third-party candidate, while I don't advocate it or disparage that notion, has enormous consequences. So that's one thing. I think they should learn that that the country always seems to be in dire trouble, and it always seems to get out of trouble. There's a phrase, and I quoted it slightly incorrectly earlier in a class today, that goes something like this: "The Lord God takes, in His wisdom, takes care of drunkards, the homeless, in the United States of America." Somehow, we always seem to prevail. Many people thought that Ronald Reagan would be a disastrous president. He actually thought that, he said that pollution came from trees, and he now is regarded as a giant. Many people find the notion of President Clinton 2.0 a horrifying thought, having not liked 1.0 that much, or at least the Monica aspects of it. We survived. The country seems to survive. The country is too good and too strong to be wrecked by a bad president. And we've had some real losers. I mean, from my own state of Pennsylvania, we had James Buchanan, probably the worst president. From your state of New Hampshire, we had Franklin Pierce, who almost gave the country away to the slaveholding South. We survived. We'll survive this as well. So I think having a rounded view and a long view of history should reassure people, but it should also send them to the polls. Yes, sir.
It seems like one of the big challenges that we face today is how to evaluate the truth, falsity, and authenticity of our candidates, and how to tease out what's right, what's wrong, what's truth, what's not. And with the shifting media climate now, do you have any sense of where we're going to go? And
well, I haven't noticed any shift in the media climate. You still all get your newspapers in the morning, right? Yeah, on the porch. But it's a serious question. How to evaluate? I mean, first of all, for most of our history, we've had a partisan press that was even more dysfunctional than the one we have today, and even less reliable. By and large, I think the traditional press has done a pretty decent job in covering this election. It's hard to say that you don't know where all the candidates stand. I used to hear this all the time. You know, we don't know what the candidates stand on taxes. Well, you've got to be, you have to be hiding somewhere in Crawford Notch not to know where the candidates stand on the issues this time. There's a sense of, people seem to sense what the character of these candidates are, and I think the public sense of them is not inaccurate. The new media has provided, a lot of bull on one side and a lot of pretty interesting perspective on the other, and I think you should view it much the way I viewed the student cafeteria here at UNH. There was an amazing amount of stuff there. I wanted to consume it all. Some of it was bad for me, some of it was good for me and I didn't really want it, and I ended up going for seconds for the things I liked. And that's, I think, how we consume our news. Going for seconds for the things you like is probably not the healthiest thing for your caloric level or your intellectual acuity. So I think one thing I hope you do teach among your students here, Heidi, and some of your other colleagues here, is the need to read, to be discomforted. Now, I don't want to get involved in the University of Chicago fight here, but I do want to say that it's important that people read things about politics that they don't agree with. If you're a liberal, please read the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. You'd be surprised how brilliant those editorials are and how persuasive they are. And if you are a conservative, well, you should read the New York Times editorial page as well. You should read the Weekly Standard along with the New Republic. Of course, you should read the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette online, and I can sell you at a very reasonable price an online subscription, and you'll be very satisfied with the work you get there. Yes?
Thank you so much for coming. The problem with your cafeteria analogy is that you were able to survey all of the food choices. In the old days...
Not until I got to the bathroom did I know what the result was.
Too much information. In the old days, we had Cronkite and Huntley and Brinkley and whatever, and all of us, regardless of our perspective, had an opportunity to come together. Now what we have is a situation in which one finds the information with which they are most comfortable and do not see the cafeteria plan. If I could just very briefly tell you a story about Durham in 2000 election. I was at the polls, as I always am, and a group of young women came out and they were ecstatic. They were really excited, and I went up to them and I said, "Is this the first time that you voted?" And they said yes, and I gave the speech that all the old people give. Isn't it wonderful? Isn't it terrific? Make sure you never miss another vote, blah, blah, blah. And then I asked if they could tell me for whom they voted. These were all UNH students. And they said they voted for Nader. And I asked why. And they said, well, there is no difference between the two candidates. And I then said, well, let me just give you one example. Let me give you the example. You're all young women and you want to control your own bodies. Let me give you the example of reproductive rights. And when I laid it out to them just a little bit, their response was, well, that's protected by the Constitution. We don't have to worry about that. And that attitude comes back right here to this campus, to every campus across the country, and to high schools which no longer teach civics. So those are my concerns about how do we find a way for people to expose themselves to the variety of views.
Well, I would say two things about that. One is that it's a very narrow slice of our cultural history in which we've had a press that was mostly unaffiliated with political parties. And I'm just guessing here that the period, say, 1925 to 2000, okay? So that's 75 years in the life of a country that's, what, 240 or 50, I don't know, whatever it is, more than 2¼ centuries old. So that period was relatively brief. I would also say that I don't think it's an illegitimate view though discomforting to you and to me, that the Republicans and Democrats are really not that different, and that Ralph Nader was different. Now, he was different for many reasons, but I don't think it's necessarily an illegitimate view that the Republicans and Democrats really are pretty similar, and that they have more in common with each other than the rest of the country. And so in a European system, the Republicans and Democrats would be kind of like this, on a spectrum that went like this. They'd be a little bit to the center right, and there'd be, a socialist party and a communist party over here, and there'd be all the parties over there. So I don't think their view was uninformed, but maybe not totally illegitimate. And of course, their view resulted in the election of George W. Bush, which might not have been what they wanted, but maybe it was what they wanted. So their view was consequential, but it wasn't necessarily intellectually empty. I think I had lunch with one of your professors here who teaches German history, and I think if she looked at the spectrum of the German political parties, she would see as, I can't believe that I'm actually quoting George Wallace here, that there wasn't much of a dime's worth of a difference between the two parties. And on some things, they're not. And there are a lot of people, serious people, who believe, I'm not one of them, but there are some serious, legitimate people who believe that the Republicans and Democrats are really not that different. Now, I would go a little further here and to say that today's Republicans and today's Democrats are a lot more nearly different than they ever were, and that today's Republicans really have become a conservative party, while the Democrats have become a liberal party. And this is fairly new in our history. President Roosevelt in 1937, and towards the election of 38, wanted to remake the Democratic Party as a party that got rid of the segregationists from the South, got rid of those committee chairmen, got rid of the conservatives from the old Confederacy, and really embraced the urban Northeast and some of the Midwest and have a liberal party. And he tried to purge all those senators, and he lost. The American Political Science Society in 1956 had a whole issue of their journal talking about how horrible and unworkable were the American parties that really stood for nothing. And so Roosevelt on one hand and the American Political Science Association on the other wanted us to create ideological parties. Now, we finally do have them, and it isn't working for us. It's not working for us at all. We were a much healthier country, I think, and this, of course, portrays me as a hopeless centrist, but and an antiquarian as well. But I think we were much healthier when we had a Republican wing a liberal wing of the Republican Party and a conservative wing, although I could have done without the segregationists, of the Democratic Party. But today, the most conservative Democrat is more liberal than the most liberal Republican, and that's why they can't talk to each other. So I don't think it's working for us, even though President Roosevelt's probably very happy today, and a lot of your political scientists here on staff must think that this is a great thing, but I don't. Yeah.
To that point, what do you think accounts for the fact that so many Bernie supporters are migrating to Gary Johnson? Because there couldn't be a wider gulf between a social democrat and a libertarian.
Well, I didn't hear part of that.
What do you think accounts for the fact that many Bernie supporters are now supporting or moving to Gary Johnson because of the huge gulf between libertarians and social democrats?
Well, the question is, why is Gary Johnson getting people who wanted Bernie? Well, I think a couple of reasons. First of all, I think there are a lot of young people on this campus and elsewhere who do believe there's no difference between the two of them, that they're both rotters, and that we should, they're not worth, either of them isn't worth anything, and that a vote for Gary Johnson is a protest vote. But I don't think 6 of them in this entire campus have any idea what Gary Johnson has to say about national security, the Federal Reserve Bank. They surely know what he has to say about legalized marijuana. But some of his other views that they might find actually odious and repugnant. That his notion, I'm libertarian, and he's really serious about being a libertarian. He was a serious man, and he was a very good governor of New Mexico. They think it's an inconsequential vote, but I think if you think about 2000, it is a consequential vote. one of the other reasons is that the Bernie people tend to be true believers. They actually think that politics is on the level, and it's not. And by that I mean they think that you can be a purist and prevail. And one of the candidates running for president wrote a book called The Art of the Deal. Politics is the art of the possible, not the art of the not the celebration of the impossible. Now, Bobby Kennedy and Jack Kennedy spoke about idealism and its place in American politics, and President Obama talked about hopes we can believe in and all this kind of stuff. But really, we're talking about legislation we can pass. And I think at some point some cold water ought to be poured on some of this stuff, not because I don't like Gary Johnson or I want one of the other candidates to win, but I think the Gary Johnson vote might be a vote of ignorance. Now, he's not an ignorant man, and Bill Weld surely is not. And they're both serious-minded people, and there's no more fun and smarter person in politics than Bill Weld. But I don't even think that Bill Weld agrees with some of the stuff that Gary Johnson believes in. I don't consider Gary Johnson a threat to the Republic or anything like that, but he's not John Anderson of 1980. Of course, that argument will be meaningless to most of your students.
You mentioned that blue-collar workers had been a staple of the Democratic Party for a long time. And given that they're reporting more prosperity, and given the differences between the two political parties, why is there this uncertainty about the blue-collar worker vote? Is that just a factor of this election, or is it a more...
Well, I think a fair-minded critique of the Trump appeal is that he has the right prescription, right diagnosis, but no prescription. And Mrs. Clinton has a prescription, but no diagnosis. And I think that in an ordinary political year, Jeb Bush would have won the Republican nomination. He's perfectly situated for where the Republican Party used to be, and for the profile of a normal so-called Republican Party. But this isn't a normal year. And so the Republicans are running somebody who's not a Republican. And there's a wonderful story from the 1964 Republican convention when Barry Goldwater gave his speech, and everybody thought, like most Republican candidates, he would move to the center. And he started giving the speech, and one wag said to another, "My God, he's going to run as Barry Goldwater." Donald Trump's running as Donald Trump. He's not running as a Republican candidate, though. So I think that's what this is about. Yeah.
I have a question. I'm really worried about these people who are saying, I'm not going to vote for Hillary and I'm not going to vote for Trump. I'm going to vote for blah, blah, blah. And I just think that helps Trump. And I don't think enough's been said about that in our newspapers and on our discussions maybe on the television, whatever. I think it's an important thing.
Well, this is a question from Mrs. Vernelli, and I'm trying to find what I said about this earlier. Her critique is that a vote for one of the third-party candidates is a vote for Trump. It may be and it may not be. I had a conversation the other day with Joe McQuaid, who is the publisher and president of the Union Leader, and he was a pretty smart guy. And he said that he didn't know, the Union Leader has endorsed Gary Johnson. He told me he did that because now he can sleep well at night. But I asked him who that affects, and he says he doesn't actually know whether that will help or hurt either one of these candidates. It's hard to know. I mean, you could tell with Ralph Nader, no conservative was voting for Ralph Nader, just as there was no Jewish vote for Pat Buchanan in Florida during that recount. He had a great laugh about the people who voted by mistake for him in the heavily Jewish precincts. He said, "Didn't these people pay attention?" So I don't know how that comes down, and I don't know. I don't know in the state how it comes down. I don't know how it comes down nationally, but I do know that in some places, Gary Johnson is running ahead of Hillary Clinton among younger voters, particularly in the state of Iowa, where Hillary Clinton is running third right now. Trump, Johnson, and Clinton, and she's within the margin of error of Johnson. In fact, 1 or 2 percentage points behind. But nonetheless, there's a lot of students in Iowa. Iowa has 2 huge campuses, plus a lot of little colleges. It's very much like New Hampshire. It and New Hampshire always have the highest SAT and ACT scores, and are regarded as the 2 most literate states in the country. So it's odd that people don't know about this in the state, and there's still a long time, and we'll see. I know I've written it 3 or 4 times. Yes.
Could you comment on the initiative to bypass Electoral College a number of years ago? There was really hope that if enough state legislatures pledged their electoral votes.
Now, Dr. Frank here has asked about the effort to kind of get rid of the Electoral College. And, you know, I do a couple of these speeches, a lot of these speeches, and I usually get easy. I haven't ever gotten questions as hard as this. Okay, so the Founding Fathers established the Electoral College to regularize the election, to make sure that there wasn't too much power to the people. I mean, the Constitution in some ways took power away even as the Bill of Rights gave power to people. It was not intended to be a democratic system. And in fact, until I think 1806, when the reform was changed, you voted for 2 people without indicating whether one was for the presidency and one was for the vice presidency. And it's been a while since I took Introduction to U.S. History, so if any of you are teaching that, you can tell me if I'm right or wrong. Which produced the crisis of 1800. Then there was a small period of time, until around 1836, when states allowed split delegations of electors to go to Washington to choose the presidency. Maine in 1828 sent 8 electors for John Quincy Adams and 1 for Andrew Jackson. That basically was ended by the end of the middle, 3/4 through the last century. More recently, in 1969, Maine, and in 1972, Nebraska, passed legislation to award their electoral votes winner take all, except for 1 vote for each congressional district. And in all of that time, only once, and I think it was Obama's first election, did Nebraska give 1 electoral vote to Obama and the rest of its electoral votes to McCain. This time, and this is vital in a close election, and we can ask Andy to chip in on this. This time, Maine, the 2nd congressional district, which begins at the coast, skirts Waterville, goes down, it skirts Colby, but it includes Bates, and goes down to the western mountains. That's the 2nd congressional district. That congressional district, am I right, Andy, is about 12% pro-Trump. The rest of the state, which, as I say, goes from Governor LePage's hometown of Waterville south and east, is about 15 for Clinton. So the chances are that Clinton will win that state, and that she will get the 2 electoral votes that are accounted for by the 2 senators, and the 1 vote for the 1st congressional district, but might not get that 4th electoral vote. So we may be in a situation, for only the 2nd time in modern history, that a state splits its electoral votes. Now, some people think that's horrifying. And other people think that that might be the way to make some tiny steps toward regularizing and democratizing American presidential elections. In most of our elections, and you know the exceptions, 2000, you'll help me on this, 1872, 76, and was one more. 1824, right? 3 times the winner of the popular vote did not win the Electoral College. And so that skewed, in some minds, skews people. You know, I'm a traditionalist, and I am now living in a National League city, and I really am glad to do that because I don't like the DH rule, the designated hitter. But the designated hitter rule is probably good for baseball. And these reforms are probably good for politics, even though I kind of like the old system because I know the old system. I don't want to learn a new one. And I like the idea that the pitcher bats last. I don't like to see the designated hitter up there batting fourth or third.
The initiative I was referring to was the one that has pledged something, I believe, over 200 electoral votes of the 272 required.
You mean 270?
And the state legislature can direct its electoral votes not to the winner of the popular election in the state. They could
Right.
pledge it.
But let me just, yes, I'm familiar with that. But let's just remember that until 1916, American senators were elected by the state legislatures. Now, you have a peculiar state legislature here in that anyone can run, and it's basically, it's a big town meeting. But most of the rest of us live in states where the state legislators are not the kind of people you want to choose the President of the United States. That's all I can say. We have time for one more.
Could I just ask you?
Go ahead.
Could I just ask you about what I consider to be the 800-pound gorilla and the difference that we see in this election, and that is campaign financing?
Well, yeah, now, that is an $800 million gorilla, but who does it help in this particular election? I don't know. I mean, Hillary's pouring gazillions into, he's not pouring, I mean, he's a rich guy who throws his money around, except he's not doing that much this time. I'm getting emails 3-4 times a day from his kids asking for money. Now, I think I should be asking his kids for money. Yeah, Skittles. And so, I don't know. This election is confounding everybody on this. But you know, there are lots of elections where people throw a lot of money in and lost. And if you don't believe me, think about the gubernatorial race in 2000, and I guess it was 2014 in California. Lots of places, you know, there's a famous story from the 1976, I think, Republican, no, 1980, 76, no, 80, I think, Tom, you'll help me on this. The $6 million delegate for John Connolly, was that 80 or 76? That would have been 1980. The $6 million delegate, he spent $6 million, which in those days was a lot of money, and he got one delegate. I mean, people can spend a lot. Yeah, Andy, you want to add something?
1896 was the most expensive presidential election in U.S. history on a per vote basis on a GDP basis. You always have that.
1892. Right. Okay, and the Democrat won that, right?
No, that was William McKinley beat.
McKinley.
Right.
Yeah. No, McKinley was elected in 96.
1896, yeah.
Oh, I thought you said 1892. Okay, yeah, 1896. That was the Mark Hanna election. Yeah. So, Mark Hanna, that's right. He and I, and Tom and I could go on with this forever, and it would bore the tears out of you. If you want relief, I'll say goodbye and thank you, and if you want more, I'll answer your questions.
And let me just add, we look forward to seeing many of you over the next couple days as the College of Liberal Arts and UNH continue to celebrate our 150th anniversary, to kick off our fundraising game, our hopefully victorious football game on Saturday. So thank you all so much for being here. Would you join me once again in thanking David Shribman for his time?